My name is Ron Haskins. I'm a senior fellow here, and along with Belle Sawhill, who will be on the second panel, we run something called the Center on Children and Families. I'd like to welcome you all to Brookings. And we're here to analyze a report called Not Yet, the Benefits and Costs of Delayed Marriage in America. I have never had so many questions about the title of a report. And almost everybody thought how clever it was, and then some were in a conversation and say, did you think up the title? And it took all the self-discipline I had to say, no, I didn't. It was probably Heimowitz who did it. But what a great title, Not Yet, K-N-O-T. So the report is written by Kay Heimowitz, whom we hear from in just a minute, and Jason Carroll, Brad Wilcox, and Colleen Kay. And it was sponsored by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. We could say 5 minutes in every event if we never used that whole title, but and the Relate Institute and the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. So here's our plan for how we're going to proceed. First, Kay will give us an overview of the report and with a PowerPoint and all kinds of interesting things. Many of you probably know Kay. She's quite a well-known writer. My favorite of her, actually she has so many I probably shouldn't pick a favorite, but she wrote a book called Manning Up, How the Rise of Women Has Turned Men into Boys. She never met my wife, but I would be a prime example of how wives can turn men into boys. But so, Kay, thank you so much for coming. Then we're going to have comments from a panel of three people. Jamelle Bouie, who's a writer for the American Prospect and a Nobler Fellow at the Nation Institute, and has written many things, especially about political issues at the American Prospect. And then my old good friend Andy Cherlin, who's come here from vacation, flying all the way up from Miami. What a great thing for him to do. He's a Griswold Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins and the author, pertinent to this event, of Marriage Go Round, which I think it gets my nomination at least for the most thoughtful critique of those of us who are somewhat apoplectic about the problems with marriage in our society and totally unbalanced. And Andy brings some balance, and I think he'll do that here today. And then we're quite fortunate also to have Ross Douthat, who's a writer for the New York Times, and famously wrote a book called The Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. They didn't listen to him. I think it's not true, the rumor that he was the author of Romney's 47% comment. I think it's probably not true, but so they'll each have a chance to talk, and then they'll sit down, and I'll try to stir up some trouble between them, and then we'll give the audience a chance to ask questions, and that will be followed by a panel, and I'll introduce the panel in due course when they come here, and so we'll start with Kay Heimowitz. Kay, thank you so much.
Just tell me how I advance the slides.
Just like that.
Okay. All right. I wish I could claim credit for the title of this report. Unfortunately, I cannot. Bill Albert, who I assume he's here someplace, thought of that. Thanks, Bill. Great title. At any rate, good morning, everybody, and welcome. We set out about a year ago to look at a very well-known trend, that is the trend towards later marriage, and I think you'll find some of our factual findings very interesting, and perhaps some of our exploration of the reasons and consequences of later marriage controversial and interesting, and a source of a lively discussion later this morning. So let's look at that trend. This slide shows you the rise in median age of first marriage, and you can see that by the early 70s, that age started to rise quite a bit and has been going up pretty steeply ever since. Americans actually had always married a little bit later than people in other parts of the world, but later meant early 20s. This trend that we're looking at here is something historically new. There was one result of that, of course, is an increasing number of single 20-somethings, something that I've written about quite a bit before now. If you look at this slide, you'll see that this is the percent of women never married by age. The upward tick is pretty clear here as well. The 20 to 24-year-olds, about 80% now of women in their early 20s are unmarried. This, again, historically new. And between 25 and 29, about almost half unmarried. Something similar has happened with men, though they started at a slightly higher point because men tend to marry at an older age than women. But you can see that today about 90% of men in between 20 and 24 are single. Again, this is historically new, and over 50% of 25 to 29-year-olds also are single. Now, we think it's worth breaking down these numbers by education, and I'll be talking quite a bit about this as my talk goes on. Notice that where in 1990, and if the figures went back earlier, it would be even more dramatic, the age of first marriage, or rather the percentage of singles, started to go up for every education group. Now, just to explain, LTHS, for those of you who are not hip to the lingo, is less than high school. So you can see that among that group, the numbers have gone up quite a bit. HS/SC refers to high school and some college. That group also has gone up. And then college grads, that's the blue line. And the reason we think this is important is because historically, college-educated women had always married significantly later than their less educated peers. Here you can see a kind of convergence between college-educated and less educated women. And keep that in mind because, as I said, we'll be coming back to it. Notice also that there was a big jump at around the year 2000. This is a point that I'll be coming back to as well. That something seems to have happened in the last between 2000 and 2010 at any rate, and perhaps continuing to go on. Now we don't have the figures. So something quite important seems to have happened in that decade. Let's keep going. Now, what we've got then is a large number of 20-somethings who are single, and I want to add just a brief note of levity because Hollywood discovered the single 20 and 30-something in the 1990s. Some of you may be also familiar with a show called Sex and the City. I've always had, which is another example of the same thing, I've always had a sneaking suspicion that Hollywood studios have demographers on staff in their development departments. They seem to always figure these things out before a lot of academics do. And at any rate, it sounds like a gig that some of you might want to look into. By the way, this 30-something, the 20 and 30-something, single 20 and 30-something, still very much mainstay of the television entertainment these days. I will amaze you with my erudition. We have Big Bang Theory, Mindy Project, Two Broke Girls, Whitney, and a little sleeper called Girls. And by the way, one consequence of the later marriage that I want to mention just briefly, though we didn't go into it in the report, but given that I work for a journal called City Journal, I feel compelled to mention it. One consequence then is the revival of a remarkable number of neighborhoods in cities across America. Brooklyn, where I'm from, is now bursting with energetic and sometimes entrepreneurial singles. And who are starting and helping to support all sorts of businesses ranging from nail salons to gyms to bars to tattoo parlors. And I know this is true in Washington as well, although maybe not the tattoo parlors. So, benefits of later marriage, and they're considerable. We think that later marriage, the age of later the delayed age of marriage is leading to lower rates of divorce. Divorce rates have been declining since about 1980. At that point, experts estimated that about half of all first marriages were ending in divorce. Since then, the rate has been declining, and they guess that it's somewhere around 40%. Part of the reason that the divorce rate has come down is that there's less marriage among teen and young 20s who are at greater risk of divorce. But I want to just make one caveat, which is from our reading of the research, that doesn't mean the later the better. After about 24 or 25, the benefits of later marriage diminish, and the 25-year-old bride and groom are not much greater risk of divorce than the 33-year-old bride and groom. Another major benefit of later marriage is higher earnings for women, especially college-educated women. We have a chart, a very interesting chart here showing the personal income of 33 to 35-year-old women by age at marriage and education. Again, you'll see the three education groups that we've talked about, the high school dropout, the high school grad, and the college grad. For college graduates, for women who are college graduates, if they wait till age 30, they are probably going to be making more money, although the cause and effect here is a little unclear. It may be that they've simply put more energy into careers and education than the women who marry earlier. The benefits for women who are less educated are not nearly as dramatic, although among high school grads there is some benefit to waiting to the late 20s. Notice that never married women actually make the most among all three in all three categories. Among men, I couldn't help but put this in because it's so interesting, the contrast. Among men, the story is quite different. Notice that men don't gain that much by marrying after 30, anywhere near as much as women seem to, college-educated women seem to. Their benefits come by the mid-20s. Also notice that the never marrieds men do significantly worse than their counterparts who are married. And that, again, is an interesting contrast with women among whom the never married seem to make more. Now that tells us a little bit about the benefits of marriage, of later marriage. We want to concentrate a little bit from now to the end of the talk about on something we call the great crossover. Because as you'll see from this chart, as the age of marriage began to rise, the age of first birth did not follow along so closely. So by the by the late 1980s, we see what we call this great crossover. That is, if you look at the purple line, that is the line showing the median age in first birth. That goes younger than the age of marriage. So the implications of that are here. At the age of 25, 44% of women have had a baby, while only 38% have married. That's one of our most astounding statistics, I think. By the time they turn 30, about 2/3 of women, American women, have had a baby, typically out of wedlock. 48% of all first births are now to unmarried women, and that's a reflection of this great crossover. It also means that when we've been talking for many decades about the problems of teen motherhood. It is still a problem, but it doesn't describe non-marital childbearing very completely. As you can see, in 1970, the teenagers made up about 50% of non-marital births. Today, it's only 23%. The far larger group are the 20 to 29-year-olds. That's 60%. We also wanted to break down the crossover by education because, as I said before, this part of what we found here is a story about class and education. Among college graduates, this slide looks at the bottom line is the age of marriage, and the top line, the age of first child among college graduates. You can see there was no great crossover. College-educated women continue to have their children quite a bit, well, at least a year or two after they get married. No crossover there, no big change. Although there is a slight uptick, some uptick in the percentage of out-of-wedlock births among college graduates. Is still quite small. Let's look at the high school dropouts. Their numbers have been, they didn't go through a crossover because they've been having children before marriage for a very long time now. But however, again, if you look at 2000, the age of marriage jumped up between 2000 and 2010 for this group. Even though they were having children outside of marriage, they were marrying several years after children. That is no longer the case. So about 83% of children to women who are high school dropouts are to women who are not married. Now, here's where the crossover really shows up. This is among women with a high school diploma and some college, perhaps. So you can see that as of 1970, they were getting married in their early 20s, having a child a year or two later, and that continued till about 1990. Again, we're talking about, the terminology here is a little tricky. We could talk about lower middle class, working class, moderately educated. I think these all describe what the group we're talking about here. 1990, they're still having children within marriage. That changes by 2000. So that's where that crossover happens for this group. Again, it harkens back to what I showed you before, that something seems to have happened around 2000, and these numbers have really taken off since then. Okay. This is just another slide showing, the implications of what we're talking about here. Again, the percent of births, non-marital births by education. The lowest, the blue line is the college graduates. Again, about 12%. And the green line, high school or some college, that gets us up to over 50%. And the less than high school, over 60%. I'm not sure why those numbers look a little different. Oh, I know, because when I talked before about 83%, we were talking about first births. This is all births. Now, some people may assume, well, okay, people don't want to get married. They don't believe in marriage. So we looked at some of the survey evidence and found that that was not the case. Most young people say that marriage is very important, or somewhat, and the vast majority say very important or somewhat important. But there are a number of reasons that we think that this has happened, and I can only refer to them very, very quickly because my jailer here is flashing signs at me. But the point we want to emphasize is that these are mutually reinforcing causes. That is, we have economic causes, we have cultural causes, and they work together. The rise of the knowledge economy, the decline of manufacturing jobs has played a big role in later marriage, but that has also helped to change our understanding about what the meaning of marriage is. It has become what we call a capstone, and Brad will be talking about that a little bit later. Instead of a cornerstone, I'll let him pick up on that as we go on. So I'm going to stop there because I have to, and hopefully we'll be able to flesh out some of these ideas when Brad takes the podium. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. It is terribly early. I live not far away from here, but just far enough that it was difficult to come out. Thank you to the authors of the report for producing the report. Thank you to Brookings for hosting this. I read over it quite a few times, just trying to think of where I was going to approach it, since my area of expertise isn't necessarily this sort of this arena. And to that end, I'm going to tell a quick story about myself, a piece of information about myself that will kind of help you see where I'm coming from, illuminate my thinking on the report. So my main area of interest in writing about politics and writing about policy is the intersection of race, and particularly racism in the early part of the 20th century, and our current public policy choices. I very firmly believe that many of the racial outcomes we see across spheres owe themselves to particular and deliberate policy choices we made in the 20th century, in the 19th century. I'm sure many of you know that officials at all levels of government used, again, particular interventions to create a particular racial status quo, one designed to disenfranchise particular groups of people, African Americans, Hispanics, in a variety of areas of life. Knowing this, and more importantly, understanding it, has shaped my sort of contingent political views in a really important way. For example, I'm a little uncomfortable with race-based affirmative action. I think it comes with all sorts of downsides that we should want to avoid. It may encourage mismatch among colleges, among low-income students. It may confer a stigma on students who are recipients of race-based affirmative action, and in a lot of circumstances, it benefits mainly higher-income students of color. With that said, I am very much aware of the background radiation of institutionalized racism and prejudice that means that if you were to move away from something like race-based affirmative action, there's a fairly good chance you'll end up in a situation where you're replicating the inequalities that we're trying to stop. In much the same way, I, like the authors of the report, I think like everyone or most people on this panel, am concerned with the great crossover. I generally don't think it's a good thing for people to be having children outside of marriage, and for people to be having children, they don't have the firm economic foundations underneath them. And I would like to find a way to ameliorate this using public policy, using our tools that we have at all levels of government. But, and this is a very large but, I'm also aware that we have this tremendous background radiation of gender inequality, of sexism, of in some areas, still considered efforts to limit the opportunities of women in a wide variety of circumstances. So for as much as I would like to see policies design particular policies for particular interventions for this particular problem, you also run into the concern, and this is acknowledged in the report, that you may end up reproducing or reinforcing particular inequalities that we've gone some ways in addressing. Currently, there's, I guess, a big ongoing conversation over Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. And one of the criticisms of the book when it came out, and this criticism emerged before anyone really read it, which made it a hilarious criticism, but one of the criticisms of the book was that why are we so focused on the concerns and the problems of high-status, wealthy white women, who the argument goes don't really have much of a problem. But the fact of the matter is that, as we all know, the higher echelons of business and politics are still not very, I wouldn't say unfriendly to women, but they're not well represented. Women aren't well represented, which means that we do still kind of have a problem. It is important for girls, younger women, to see women in these positions of high status. So, when it comes to, and I'm sure we will discuss over the course of this morning, particular targeted interventions to address the great crossover. But in doing so, I think we should all keep in mind the fact that we're not so far removed from pervasive gender inequality, gender inequality sanctioned by the state. We're not so far removed from that we can simply not worry about the potential implications of policies that may try to encourage people to get married at a younger age, from their late 20s to their mid 20s, that may encourage particular patterns of childbirth. Now, I don't think that means you don't do anything. I'm not one for futility. And I think that the area you go when trying to address these problems, it's not so much particular interventions, but sound macroeconomic policy. As Kay mentioned, at least a chunk of this has everything to do with the collapse of the economy for lower income workers and high school graduates. I'm reasonably sure that if today it were possible for a low status, low income high school graduate, high school guy, to get a job that supported a family, or at least supported him and someone else, we would not be looking at the great crossover, or at least it wouldn't be as, it wouldn't be as big of a problem as we're currently looking at. And so, to that end, I think the focus for policymakers ought to be building sound macroeconomic policy, which is something we haven't really been doing for the last 10 years. It's striking to look at the broad economic mismanagement by both parties, by political figures of all stripes. No attempts to deal with stagnant wages, no attempts to deal with rising income inequality, no attempts to deal with the skyrocketing cost of college, no attempts to deal with the collapse of the manufacturing sector, which is partially a product of trends that are sort of beyond the control of policymakers, and partially a product of the fact that it's not that many people in the policymaking realm were terribly concerned, that they hoped that the gains from global trade would outweigh any loss in jobs in manufacturing and in lower income areas, and that simply hasn't been the case. And I'm willing to bet a lot of money, a reasonable amount of money, that the distinct lack of marriageable men on the lower income side, which the report notes, has everything to do with the fact that we don't have an economy that's designed to help lower income, low education men flourish, or lower income, low education people to flourish. And fixing that, addressing that, I think ought to be our primary concern. And once you fix that, once you address that, there I think are all sorts of social welfare things, to put it in not a very precise term, that can help. During a State of the Union, President Obama proposed a plan for universal pre-K. I know many liberals would love to see more robust services to help young parents, young families. And these are the kind of things that make marriage easier, that make child rearing easier. And if you have access to better jobs, if you have access to better opportunities, and there is a government that is interested in making child rearing and making family making an easier endeavor, I think you would see people decide that maybe they don't need to wait so long to get married, knowing that there's a fundamental level of support below them. I'm running out of time. The time thing really, when you see it, you're just sort of like, okay, you got to wrap it up. I wish there were like a flashing light that said wrap it up.
It gets worse than that.
I know. To wrap this up quickly, there are a few other areas in which we could use interventions, ensuring that debt loads for students graduating from college aren't so high, ensuring debt loads for people graduating grad school aren't so high, and sort of getting all these things in order, I think, will go a long way towards addressing our problem. On the whole, though, I think that those are the approaches we should exhaust before moving to anything more particular and anything that tries to encourage particular sorts of behavior, precisely because we have this background of inequality that is with us and probably isn't going away for a very long time. Thank you.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm one of the people on this panel who's supposed to give you a liberal response to the report. But if you expect a fiery liberal dissent from this report, I'm going to have to disappoint you. Because, in fact, I agree with most things in this report. And I commend it for saying that the issue here is not just a cultural issue, it's a mix of culture and economics. That's as opposed to some other reports perhaps, for example, Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, which suggests that it's all just a cultural problem. The willingness of these authors to say it's both economics and culture is, I think, forming a basis for some cooperation and consensus in the center of what have been bitter and unproductive family policy debates in Washington for decades. I would like to see us move forward. I think we can move forward if we agree that, yes, there have been important cultural change, but the economic changes have been very important too. Now, I want to talk about cohabitation. I want to emphasize, demographers think nearly all the growth of childbearing to single mothers over the last couple of decades has been to mothers who are cohabiting. There's almost no increase among what you think of as single mothers, mothers living alone or with a grandmother. It's couples. Now, some of these cohabiting couples are formed after the woman gets pregnant, and they decide to live together for a few years because it's better for the child, but without a long-term commitment. Some of my research colleagues have taken to calling these shotgun cohabitations. But the only person holding the shotgun today is the baby, and these cohabitations are quite unstable. The problem, though, is not cohabitation per se. The problem is American-style cohabitation. We have the shortest duration of cohabiting unions of any Western country. After a couple of years, we either break up or we get married, and increasingly the decision is to break up. Part of the reason, then, that we have such a high rate of turnover, what distinguishes us from other wealthy countries, is the sheer number of changes that children see in their residential arrangements over their lives. In some Western European countries, there are long-term cohabiting unions that last decades, and I don't think those are any worse for children than long-term marriages. So, yes, marriage is very important, but so is stability. And sometimes we might be able to encourage stability even if we can't successfully encourage marriage, and that might be a worthy goal. For example, a 8-site random assignment study of relationship enhancement programs was just finished, funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, called Building Strong Families. Unfortunately, there were no effects in 7 of the 8 sites on marriage probability or any other measures of couples in the experimental group who got a curriculum of relationship enhancement and employment assistance information. But in Oklahoma, there was some effect. In fact, I hear so much about Oklahoma in these forums that sometimes I think I've wandered into a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. Oklahoma had one effect. It was that parents in the experimental group stayed together more so that children in the experimental group were more likely to live with 2 parents for a longer time than were children in the control group. There was no effect on marriage, however. Oklahoma managed to encourage stability, but not marriage. I think we ought to pursue what happened in Oklahoma and see if we can replicate it, although I certainly think we have to realize that the fact that it didn't work for 7 out of 8 sites suggests that Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plains, may be a somewhat different place than, say, Baltimore, my home, which was another site. Now, I certainly think that the transformation of the American economy is the primary reason we've seen these trends. Outsourcing, automation. It's no coincidence that the college-educated Americans who you saw in those charts are waiting until after marriage to have children and divorcing much less than they used to. Those are the winners in our new globalized automated economy. And those are the people who are still marrying and still waiting until after marriage to have children, whereas those with less opportunities are not. Now, I think economics is tremendously important here, but let me talk about culture and acknowledge that there are important cultural changes. I've seen them. About 40 years ago, I was teaching high school in Boston. I came home to have dinner with my parents. I told them about my new girlfriend, and they said, "Oh, she sounds nice. Where does she live?" And I said, "With me." And they nearly fell off their chairs. Had there been a 911 in those days, I would have called 911. A year later, I married her. It all worked out, but it was a shock to them. In contrast, when 5 years ago my own daughter married, I would have been shocked had she not lived with her boyfriend beforehand. That's the cultural difference that we've seen. One of the cultural differences that's made the phenomenon that the report talks about possible these days. Another, of course, is the greater acceptance of childbearing outside of marriage. But where I get off the cultural train is when the claim is made that the problem here is a lack of industriousness among young men, a lack of a wish to get ahead. This was Murray's argument in Coming Apart. He goes back to 1960 and says, wages were much lower in the 1960s, but young men work at a much higher rate. Therefore, it's really a cultural shift. Well, young men and women don't think like that. They don't go back a half century. They think about their own upbringing and their standard of living, and they compare it with what they may be able to do. And more high school educated young people, especially young men, are finding that they will not do as well as their fathers, that the jobs they can get will not replicate their standard of living, and they are discouraged workers because of that, rather than because they are less industrious. Some say the reason that divorce rates have fallen so fast among the college educated is that they were the victims of the high divorce rates of the 1980s and are determined not to make the same mistakes with their parents. Perhaps. But working class young adults were also affected by divorce. They also have the same desire to avoid the mistakes of their parents, but they've not been able to do it nearly as much. Divorce rates have not fallen for them nearly as much. Why? Because they can't actually do what needs to be done, which is create the stable marriages they want, not because they don't want them, not because they don't value them, but because they can't find the economic basis for doing them. Finally, I'd like to mention an important cultural change that's not occurred and that should occur and that's holding back progress. And this is the continuing resistance of young men to take the kinds of jobs that in the past have been labeled as women's work. It's an outmoded definition of masculinity that's holding us back. For example, between 1975 and 2010, the percentage of physicians who were women increased from 13% to 32%, a huge increase. The percentage of men who are nurses increased from 3% to 9%. Being a nurse is a great job, pays well, has lots of skills. It's rewarding and challenging, but men won't take those jobs because it's women's work. Or take my line of work, college teachers. Over that same interval, the percentage of college teachers who were female has gone from 31% to 46%. But how about elementary school teachers and middle school teachers? The percentage of men in those jobs has gone from 15% to 18%. Now, these are the jobs that are still expanding, that are in the service sector, that pay well. And men must begin to take them in larger numbers if we are to solve this problem. But because of the outdated definitions of masculinity that young men have, they don't take them. What's happened is that in school and among young adults, it's okay for girls to be like boys now. They can achieve in school, they can be good athletes, that's accepted. But it's not okay for boys to be like girls. Boys who do stuff in middle school that's girl stuff risk being labeled gay by their peers. Apparently the worst insult you can say to a middle school boy, even though it's not clear that anybody knows exactly what they're talking about when they use the word. The policing of masculinity, the inability of men to get beyond men's work and take the jobs that are actually there, I think is an overlooked facet of why we have such a problem of young men not working and taking the jobs that are there. So here's one liberal who agrees that cultural change is important, including the cultural changes that have not occurred. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion so far. I am actually going to provide a fiery liberal dissent. No, I'm kidding. Instead, I'm actually going to take up, start where Jamel left off, saying that he didn't want to offer a counsel of futility, and talk a little bit about futility, because I think it's useful for people involved in these debates and discussions to recognize the reasons why, even though stories about changing family structures and so on may end up at the top of, let's say, the New York Times most emailed list, they don't have a huge impact, or at least in my experience, they don't have a huge impact on recent policy debates in Washington, D.C., and really cultural discussions more broadly. And I think that it goes, in a sense, to Professor Cherlin's point about what is so great about this report, and a lot of the work that Brad and others have done over the years, is the willingness to acknowledge the intersection of culture and economics in these issues. But it's precisely that intersection that makes our political discussion not really know how to deal with these issues. And so start with the Republican Party, the conservative movement, conservatism in America writ large. I think it's fair to say that in general, conservative interest in these trends is often higher than liberal interest, because it's a story that social and cultural conservatives in particular, myself very much included, are, you know, I wouldn't say they're happy to jump on it, because it's obviously a story that's problematic and tells a story of family decline and so on, but it dovetails in many ways with a social conservative worldview, right? The idea that, you know, once the family was stronger than it is today, then various forces, cultural and economic, but especially cultural, swept through American society starting in the 1960s, and now we're in much more of an unstable mess. The problem is that precisely the fact that that narrative is so attractive to so many conservatives means that it becomes a reason for conservatives involved in politics, and particularly conservatives involved in the institutional Republican Party, not to talk about the economic side of the discussion. So, for instance, if President Obama proposes policy X, Y, or Z that seems to be targeted at working class men, working class America in general, a very commonplace conservative and Republican response will be, well, this is all well and good, but he's not talking about the real driver of the problem, which is the decline of marriage. And obviously, I do think that the decline of marriage is a very real driver of social problems in America, but a conservatism that can't talk about the economic component, mostly because the discussion of that economic component doesn't really fit into the conversation that conservatives want to have right now, which is mostly about long-term deficits and restructuring the size and scope of government to avoid long-term deficit problems, it means that you end up with the Republican Party just talking about, when they do talk about it at all, one half of the story here. And this extends to right-of-center intellectuals as well. I have a higher opinion of Charles Murray's Coming Apart, maybe, than Professor Cherlin does, but I thought that it was an absolutely brilliant analytic work that ended with Murray throwing up his hands and saying, well, here are these trends, and there's really nothing we can do about them, and, you know, maybe eventually the collapse of the liberal welfare state, you know, in 2025 or so will lead to sort of a rebuilding of community from the bottom up. And, yeah, I mean, it's possible that that's the case, but it's not a particularly useful approach for people involved in public policy debates to take. And frankly, I think it's also mistaken as well, that there are things that policymakers can do, at least on the margins, that address some of the drivers of the social crisis that otherwise Murray, I think, does a great job of illuminating. So that's the Republican half of the story. There's just a deep resistance to talking about any kind of economic component, and beyond that, to actually taking concrete steps, including, again, some of the fairly modest steps recommended at the end of this report, and I hope you do read all the way to the end, because, you know, I mean, for instance, the case we saw recently in DC was the Democrats proposing an increase in the minimum wage, and you had a lot of conservative policy wonks saying, well, here are these different problems with increasing the minimum wage, and it can actually discourage employment to some extent among working class men, which is, so the costs outweigh the benefits and so on. What you didn't see was a Republican Party saying, so here's what we should do instead, say increase the earned income tax credit, or pick whatever alternative policy response you want. You just have the critique, you don't have an alternative. And then on the liberal side, and I think actually Jamel's points did a very good job of sort of distilling liberalism's reluctance to address the cultural side of the equation, because liberalism is invested for good reason in a narrative of female advancement and so on that is very uncomfortable with the idea that we might want to, in any way, shape, or form, be seen as sort of re-subsidizing older patriarchal arrangements and so on. There's that going on. There's the fact that more generally the cultural model of marriage that is working for the upper middle class and isn't really working for the rest of society, the sort of capstone / soulmate model, is a model that liberalism is deeply invested in right now, mostly I think because of the gay marriage debate, because gay marriage is in a sense the ultimate working out of that capstone soulmate model. If you believe in that model, then the arguments for gay marriage become much more compelling. If you believe in gay marriage, the arguments for that model become much more compelling. And it's possible that on the other side of the gay marriage debate, because I think we can all sense which direction that debate is going in right now, there may be a liberalism that's more interested in sort of seeing some of the problems with the model. The question then is, to what extent is ratifying that model in public policy make that conversation harder in other ways? And then there's also an issue of political self-interest, where the Democratic Party, and again, I don't think there's any sort of cynical, conscious gamesmanship going on, but the Democratic Party benefits from the trends described in this report. It's fairly clear that family instability and sort of the rise of single life, single parenting, sort of people raising kids by themselves without partners and so on, increases public support for a more active government, which is completely understandable. I don't think there's a question of sort of, it's not the sort of, Mitt Romney 47%, these people are just mooching off the federal government. It's that people's lives are more unstable, more complicated when they're trying to raise children by themselves or with a partner who's sort of in and out. And so it makes more sense to, for instance, want a guarantee of universal health insurance and so on. But the fact that the Democratic Party, in its general quest for more expansive government programs and so on, benefits from these trends, makes it in turn more likely that the Democrats will tend to support policies that are general rather than particular, that say, well, we're not going to target these specific problems, we're just going to try and, increase government spending on people generally and so forth. And then finally, I would say there is the final reason that these issues don't necessarily seem to rise to sort of crisis level discussion in American politics right now is that they aren't creating the kind of crisis that a lot of people expected them to create 20 years ago. If you go back 20 years and you look at things that liberals and conservatives, but especially social conservative policy thinkers were writing, there was a huge and totally understandable focus on the link between family breakdown and crime, because America was still in the midst of a 30-year explosion in crime rates that was making cities unlivable and ungovernable and was, threatening basic public order. Over the last 20 years, the trends in family structure have continued, accelerated, whatever word you want to choose, but we've obviously, if not solved the crime problem, at least addressed it in ways that people frankly didn't expect in 1991 or 1992. And that has just made the problem seem more diffuse and less urgent. And I think it's a real problem, but this is something I think everybody involved in these discussions has to reckon with, that it manifests itself in social immobility in, if you look at some of the charts on, I don't have the page, but the charts comparing sort of rates of depression and heavy drinking and so on between, married couples versus cohabitating couples versus single couples and so on, it manifests itself in sort of the degradation of ordinary human life, but in ways that don't seem to rise to the level of a crisis in public order, a rising crime, and so on, the kind of problems that policymakers would tend to leap to address. So it's more a question of sort of, it has a negative impact, you might say, on human flourishing in the United States without sort of dragging us down into the kind of abyss that scolds and social conservatives usually like to use to threaten people with in order to interest them in dealing with problems. So I see the stop, so I'll stop there and say that I'm not as pessimistic about these issues being addressed as that spiel maybe made it sound, but I think those are realities that everyone interested in these issues should keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Supposed to be a little guy coming through there and helping us get our.
Normally I keep it off with the baby.
Okay, great. Are we hot? Okay.
We're hot.
Not yet. I'm going to ask some questions first. I get certain privileges as a moderator. So thank you to all the members of the panel. All the presentations were fascinating. I want to start with a question for Kay, and then I hope that the other panelists will jump on it. Will marriage ever resume its former exalted position as a cornerstone of American family life?
You're asking me to make a prediction.
About the future, too.
Right, about the future, which I don't like to do. I think it's going to have to be some kind of new understanding that won't necessarily be what it was in the socially conservative, glorified 50s. I think it's going to be something different. But one of the major points that we really wanted to make is that there has been this shift in understanding of what marriage is about, and that's why we keep talking about the cultural part of this. One chart I didn't get to, or one issue I didn't get to talk about, was that young people really don't see marriage as having much to do with children anymore. They're two separate things. We have significant survey data on this in the report that I hope you'll look at. But I think as long as that is the case, that is that marriage and children are two separate life events that may or may not come together, but really don't have that much to do with each other, we're going to continue to see the trends that we're talking about. I will say, just to add a little controversy here, I do believe that the economic piece of this story is a very important one, but I don't think that solving that solves this other problem of rejoining marriage and childbearing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ron, when we talk about marriage's exalted place in the past, we're implicitly, as Kay is saying, thinking back to the mid-20th century. The 1950s was the most unusual time for marriage and family that we've seen in the last century or two. We're not going to be going back to the 1950s, but we could go to a time when marriage is actually somewhat stronger than it was right now. If you had asked me 30 years ago whether the divorce rate would continue to go up or would start plunging among the college educated, I would have said, of course it's going to go up. Marriage is heading toward more divorce. That's the way things are happening. Instead, it has plunged. And among the college educated, we've seen almost a neo-traditionalism. They are waiting until after marriage to have children. Yes, marriage is the capstone event that comes at age 30, but there's nothing really wrong with that. And in fact, that seems to suggest that there's still a strong desire among Americans for a family life that's based on marriage. Should we be able to assist people with less education in having the resources and the attitudes that will get them to be married, we could see something of a revival, I think, even now.
Anybody else want to comment on it? Okay, I was glad to see you bring up, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just, I mean, one issue that we haven't really touched on here is the impact of institutional religion on, I mean, it was sort of implicit in your parents' reaction maybe to living with your fiance before marriage, but you know, part of the story here, and again, it's very tough to disentangle the economic and cultural components, but part of the story here is that our sort of cliche of working class America as sort of, you know, the pious bedrock of our society, and upper middle class America as the, you know, decadent secularists and so on, just no longer obtains. And again, Brad has done a lot of work on this, but, and you know, you can see it in the data in Charles Murray's book and so on, that, you know, the link between church-going, church attendance, involvement in the religious community, and family stability is sort of obvious, explicit, and as, again, I don't think it's the weakening of religious interest and spiritual fervor, it's just the weakening of sort of its institutional manifestations that's driven at least part of this decline. And so when I think about sort of forces that could change things more than at the margins, I mean, I think the policy debate, it's all at the margins. If you're looking at social forces that could impact this in big ways over the next 50 or 100 years, I think whatever happens with American religion is probably the biggest force there is, and it could go in either direction. I mean, I think the trend we're on now, the rise of the so-called nuns, people with no religious affiliation. I think a lot of people, sort of well-educated people, read about that trend and think of somebody, you know, a college graduate in a coffee shop reading Richard Dawkins and sort of saying like, yes, he's finished off God once and for all. But in American society, the nuns are just as likely, or in fact more likely, to be not sort of militant atheists, but, you know, again, working class men whose disattachment from religion is part of just a broader lack of social attachment. And so, are there future churches that could reach those men? Maybe. Are churches just going to keep getting weaker? And, you know, I mean, are Hispanic immigrants going to continue to drift away from the Catholic Church and so on? I mean, you could imagine the trends going in either direction, depending on what happens in trends in American religious life.
Okay, Jamal, I give you the right to be the first to respond on the next question, okay? Because I want to move ahead here. I was glad to see Kay mention kids, because in this debate, I think kids should be a very prime consideration. I'm going to assert that there's widespread agreement in the academic community, which is quite unusual and did not always exist, that the best rearing environment for children is a married couple family. And in fact, some people go even further and say their biological parents married to each other is the best way to raise children. And that single parent families are associated with lots of bad outcome from kids. It does not mean that no single parent can do a great job of raising children, but on average, and social science is based on averages, kids from female-headed families are worse off in almost every way. Roughly speaking, if it's something bad, they have more of it. If it's something good, they have less of it. So with that in mind, first of all, does anybody disagree with that?
Well, just to raise a qualification, Ron, I think kids do best in stable two-parent homes. The way we tend to do that in this country is through marriage. In other places like Western Europe, we can do it through long-term cohabitation. How we get that stability is important, and I grant you that in the U.S. that's likely to be marriage, and therefore marriage is certainly worth supporting.
Right. I would totally grant your point, by the way, about if couples cohabited and stayed together for 200 years, we wouldn't have a problem. But they don't. The average, I mean, we have all, in fact, there's some data in the report. Brad has published a lot of data. There's all kinds of data. If you take kids when they're born and they're in a cohabiting compared to marriage, the breakup rate for cohabiting is something like 4 times as great. So
but not in Sweden. I mean, it's true that
Sweden,
the Scandinavian,
right.
there is a Scandinavian model.
That puts you back on the cultural issue. What are you going to do to make our cohabitation like theirs? So if it's true with some caveats.
IKEA is working on it.
What?
The spread of IKEA in American, sorry.
I'm not talking about furniture here. Anyway, so here's the question. If this contributes, if the problems with children contribute in many ways to our economy and to inequality, and to mobility in the United States, doesn't that give even more urgency to this issue of kids being reared by married parents? You have the right of first refusal here.
I'll answer the question.
Good.
No, I think it does. This is sort of, I feel a little schizophrenic on the issue, in part because I do think that it's very important for children to be raised in long-term relationships, whether those are marriage or long-term cohabitation. I'm not sure. I don't think it's that important which one it is, but it needs to be something. It could even be sort of just like a stable extended family, not just a two-parent household. But I have this sort of basic discomfort with targeted policy initiatives to reach or to fix that problem, in part because I have a surprising lack of imagination with regards to it. I just can't imagine how you would do it and structure it in such a way that would avoid the problems I'm worried about. And so maybe someone far more entrepreneurial than I am when it comes to policy could figure something out. But with the tools that we have and the tools that in the current political context we would actually discuss, I'm not sure how you get to point B.
Okay.
You know, I agree, actually, that the policy levers here are few. We're looking for creative answers out there, and perhaps somebody here has some. But, you know, most of the ones that I've heard, and most of the ones even that we've mentioned in our report, have been said before. Are they achievable? There's a big question about that. I just want to, though, answer one point that Jamil made that about the gender inequality problem. My reading of what happens to women in the workforce is that they are far better off being married than being single. If you're really worried about gender inequality, then you want to worry about the rise of single motherhood, and it's usually motherhood, because those women are held back by the fact that they do not have partners. And I don't see any way for policy to deal with that. So that's just something to keep in mind on that.
Andy.
Go ahead, Russ.
No, you go.
No, go ahead.
Well, I may be anticipating what you were about to say, but I think one of the things that I'll often see liberals say in response to that point is that, yes, sort of women with successful marriages do better in the workforce, but part of what's happening is that because the men that women could be marrying are in some sense unmarriageable, they don't have jobs, they don't have steady work, and so on. There's a danger in just sort of encouraging marriage to men who would, who would end up just being a drag. If your husband isn't capable of finding steady work, for instance, it's probably not going to help you in your career. And now
can I just?
That's what Andy was going to say. I guarantee it. He has something new to say.
Yeah.
I do, but go ahead, Kate.
Just one a point about that. If then the question is, well, why would you be having children with a man who you don't think is capable of being a husband? And that's, again, gets back to the issue I keep bringing up, which is that there's been this divide in people's thinking about marriage. It's okay to have a child with somebody that you don't think you're going to marry, or that you maybe will marry, or is not ready to get married. So, that's one of the cultural issues that I think we need to be addressing.
Ron, marriage is worth supporting, but what are we going to do? I think we ought to pay attention to the results released last November of the Building Strong Families 8-site random assignment test of the idea of relationship enhancement classes, financial management classes, as a way to help young adults who've just had a child but aren't married to get married. I was not a big fan of this experiment, but I found myself very disappointed and saddened that it had no effects in 7 out of the 8 sites, that we were not able to do it. Now, Oklahoma had some effects. Good people designed those programs. I think we should pursue those effects and see if we can get them to work. And there is a second big experiment that we'll see final results for sometime later this year of young married couples who want to stay married. Can we help them marry? We haven't seen that. Nevertheless, the healthy marriage strategy of relationship enhancement classes, where you teach people better strategies about how to manage conflict, has unfortunately been shown to be not very good. I would not place it on my list of very large programs to have a lot of money go to right now?
I'm going to ask second panel that very question. You want to make a
Well,
brief?
I would just say, I mean, I tend to be deeply skeptical of programs that sort of specifically set out to go to individual couples and help them strengthen their marriages, mostly just because of a skepticism about scaling up. I'm very confident that a really dedicated team in a particular community could design a somewhat successful program. It's a little disappointing that it didn't work in most cases, but I imagine it's possible. It's just, as in terms of national policy, you know, the problem of scaling up exists in almost all these cases. In that case, it seems particularly difficult. I think what you want is, you know, you want basically a welfare state that, you know, is work and family oriented in ways that our current welfare state often isn't. And that means, you know, that you want to look at things like the payroll tax, you want to look at things like a child tax credit, you want to look at things like the earned income tax credit, places that, again, I think conservatives and Republicans should be much more interested in focusing on than they actually are, and that liberals, I mean, I think some of the things that the president has done that I've supported have been in that area, but I think the liberal tendency in general is to, you know, is to say, well, it's to build sort of universal programs that aren't focused on sort of work and family in particular, and those sort of universal programs in general are sort of on an unaffordable trajectory. So I don't know. There's a phrase that I always quote that the economist Ed Glazer likes to use, that small government egalitarianism. And I think that there's a policy-making sweet spot there that neither party is trying to hit. But again, I think it's all happening on the margins.
We're almost out of time for this panel, but I want to ask one more question because I completely agree, and I think everybody in the panel agrees. Economics is a huge part of this. So let me say one thing about welfare reform that I think really illuminates this discussion. And that is, people think of welfare reform as very tough requirements and forcing people to work and they lose their benefits and so forth, all of which is true. But they don't talk as much about other things that government did to make welfare less attractive to young women and to make work more attractive, namely huge expansions of the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit created out of whole cloth, almost universal coverage of Medicaid, which did not exist until the late 90s, and lots of money for child care. So policymakers almost had some vision. I know Americans would find it hard to believe, but they created a system that made it a lot easier for young women to work and made it attractive. In this case, and I do agree with you, Jamel, probably the best idea is a serious wage subsidy for young males. We don't have that. We have a crummy little one for males, but a huge one. You get $5,000 for females, or whoever has custody, and it's usually in 85% of cases females. So the question to the panel is, are Republicans, I want you to focus on Republicans, can you imagine them spending $25 billion on a big wage subsidy for young men on the theory that if we do this, it's going to increase marriage rates because those young men, it'll change their life and they'll be more desirable and better partners and so forth, and the women will not only be willing to have babies with them, but to stay with them?
You asking me?
I'm asking the whole panel, but I want you to
right now, no. I mean, I think that there is the idea that has the most traction among conservative columnists and pundits and policy wonks is the idea of focusing on child tax credits, making them refundable against payroll taxes, a sort of, you know, that so it's linked to children rather than work, but because it's refundable against payroll taxes, it's linked to work as well.
But that won't help single males at all.
That doesn't help single males, no. But the hope is that it helps, you know, it helps maybe cohabitating couples make the transition to marriage more successfully. It helps already married working class couples stay together and so on. But look, the Republican Party right now, the problem the party has is that the focus on deficits and debt has meant that you can say to, you know, Republicans are willing to cut spending in one area, but they're never willing right now to plow the money into another area. And that's the sort of internal GOP hump that would have to be gotten over. You'd have to have somebody willing to say, okay, look at these cuts in, you know, the Ryan budget. We can take $25 billion out of these cuts and do something over here instead of just trying to hit the fantastic target of a balanced budget in 10 years or 5 years or 4 years. We can,
By tomorrow.
by tomorrow.
Who else? Jamel?
I'd say that on the other end of things, because I can imagine at least the liberals and Democrats I spend time with accepting that deal in part because it sort of aligns along the vision of a guaranteed basic income. It's sort of on that path. But I think I'm not sure. So like my broad critique of the American political system right now is I'm not sure that there's much of a emphasis or concern with full employment, and I think that neither party is particularly interested in trying to pursue solutions that would lead to full employment. Because when push comes to shove, moving us closer to full employment, sort of beyond pre-recession levels of unemployment, is an aidless policy for trying to address a whole swath of social ills that will fester if we sort of remain at this status quo of elevated or even like mass unemployment. And so I would love to see a program of wage support for young men, and I would love to see a program of wage support for young men coupled with a genuine commitment to getting unemployment down to at least the point where we can begin to identify whether it's structural unemployment we're dealing with or whether it's merely cyclical. At the moment, we sort of just thrown up our hands and said, oh, well,
Andy.
Ron, I would add that you should expand that credit to women, not just to men. My reading of what happens when you give low-income women more income is it allows them, let's say they're single mothers, to avoid what you might call unproductive cohabiting relationships with a guy you might be tempted to move into your apartment if the lights are about to be turned off and you need some help with the electric bill. Rather, you can wait, have a stable single-parent home, and wait for somebody who might be a better long-term partner. Giving low-income women more income is not only a good thing in itself, but it can, I think, even be pro-marriage.
I'm skeptical about that. I was going to say that not only do I not see it as a possibility the Republicans would support such a program, but I'm skeptical that Democrats would, in part because I think Andy demonstrates this point, it will be seen as anti-woman. Why should we support men when it's women who are making less money? They're the ones who need the support. So I think there'll be a lot of pushback on that from the left as well.
Well, and can you imagine, I know we're out of time, but I mean, what doesn't get talked about in these debates is people talk about a child tax credit. If you were really trying to design that policy with marriage in mind, you would say there's a child tax credit and it's only available to married couples.
Yeah, it ain't
Right?
going to happen.
Right? Well, right. And but the fact that it ain't going to happen, I think, underlines the cultural component here, which is that Americans, we don't want to do those stigmas again. And there are very good reasons why we don't want to do those stigmas again. But they also mean that when you're talking about public policy, you're sort of leaving what would be obvious options off the table.
Okay, audience. Let me caution the audience. We want questions. People came here to hear the panelists. So let's have a couple questions from the audience, right here in front.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with
Wait, you're going to get a microphone.
Okay.
Tell us your name
Penny
and ask a brief
Starr.
question.
CNS News. You were talking about stigma, and you brought up an important policy point about encouraging single parenthood, et cetera, with welfare and those kinds of programs. I would say what struck me in this conversation is that it seems to me culture, entertainment, in other words, any magazine you look at the grocery store, having a child out of wedlock is not only acceptable, but it's great. And so I would say that culture is, perpetuating the single parenthood by promoting out of wedlock marriage, and also by not saying that it's not a good thing, being very clear on that. And what struck me really quickly, too, is that I don't see anything in this conversation about people seeing marriage as a religious, not just social, but having to do with God and beliefs. Thank you.
Kay, you want to make a comment about, I think, widespread agreement that our culture is not exactly marriage
Yeah,
friendly.
though I'm using the word culture a little more broadly than that. I mean, there's no question that the popular culture reflects a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of a new understanding about marriage. But I think that the popular culture is as much reflects what most people think as it does drive it. And the reasons that people have subscribed to this capstone model and the idea that children are sort of a secondary consideration in marriage goes far beyond whatever's going on in Hollywood.
Okay, right behind her.
I'm going to pass it over to her.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. I have a question about tax.
Tell us your name.
Oh, my name is Jan Bates. I'm a resident of Alexandria. I'd like to know what you think about using the tax code to encourage marriage. We've had for a long time a marriage penalty. Why not have a marriage advantage for low-income married couples with or without children?
I mean, I'm 100% in favor of it. I think that again, right now, sort of right-wing policy wonks have sort of converged around the particular idea of the child tax credit as basically a way of doing that with children, not per se linked to marriage. I think that there are, again, sort of issues in American culture that make an explicit marriage advantage seem potentially sort of stigmatizing and discriminatory and so on. I think it would be interesting to see how the debate would play out if it were couched not in the language of, here's a tax credit that you get for getting married, but just we're going to, eliminate the marriage penalty and have a slight marriage advantage and so on. But I think that I think that the tax code is where the action is. I think the specific question of sort of tax subsidies for marriage as opposed to sort of family reflect sort of an uncomfortability that Americans have with sort of specific, saying this particular relationship deserves this particular subsidy.
So let's have two questions, and then we're going to get to the next panel. Right across the aisle there.
My name is Barbara Bergman. I guess this is leading up to a question for Mrs. Heimowitz. You have all talked about culture versus economics reasons for this going on, but you've forgotten the technological, namely the invention of the pill and the sexual revolution. And there's not going to be any going back from that. There's, as Mrs. Heimowitz admitted, there's very little that government can do to reverse this. And so we have to think, don't we, about helping children. And there are going to be more and more of them. And so the way to help children, obviously, is to turn the country into Scandinavia, to have free daycare, to have free college, to have help with housing, and so on. So as a conservative, would you go in that direction?
Okay,
as
before
someone
you
who
answer,
cares
okay.
about children.
All right, before you answer that, read right over here. Let's let him ask a question.
My question is very similar.
Tell us your name.
Todd Post from Bread for the World. My question is very similar, actually. I mean, I just want to make a statement. I sort of see this sort of cloud of nostalgia sort of hovering over the panel, and I think I can be as nostalgic as anybody else, but I think it's also important to be realistic, like that lady was saying. We're probably not going back, and she invoked the Scandinavian model. One of the things that I was going to
You have to be quick here because we're trying to get off the panel.
I was going to ask very specifically about childcare. Somebody brought up earlier that the cohabitation rate in the United States is far less than. I mean, raising children is very stressful, and if you don't have good support systems, particularly childcare, it only feeds that stress. And I know we do childcare worse than probably, or at least we invest less in childcare in this country than they do in other developed countries.
So, okay, is there any prospect conservatives are going to turn the country into Scandinavia?
Not in my lifetime.
Not in God's lifetime.
But let me answer the deeper point here, aside from the name calling and partisanship. I guess the question in my mind is, do we have any evidence that in this country the state can compensate for unstable families? We have no evidence for that. Very, very little evidence. So we can keep talking about more kinds of government programs like childcare. I think if you look at our school system and the impact of education on inequality, you would have to be fairly cynical about the prospects of government being able to substitute for these for more stable families. I don't see how that's possible.
Yes, we've had the sexual revolution. Yes, having children outside of marriage is much more acceptable than it used to be. But notice that college-educated Americans are not doing that. Right. That they're still marrying, that they're still having kids within marriage. Why is that? Yeah. Is there any evidence that they've suddenly become more culturally conservative? I've not seen it. The reason they're not doing that is because they have a firm economic basis that they can see out in the future as supporting a stable marriage. And therefore, despite all of this, they haven't changed their behavior very much. Sure, culture is important, but this economic basis, this firm economic basis, I think crucial for people's decision-making today.
Ross.
Well, should we just go to Jamel? You want to say
go
anything,
ahead.
and then
That's fine. That's fine.
I actually just lost my main idea, so you talk,
Okay.
and then I will remember.
So 3 quick points. One, to the Scandinavian point, yes, Scandinavia has subsidized daycare, but as we were saying earlier, Scandinavia also has many, many more intact two-parent families. It's just that for whatever reason, and there are deep cultural reasons there, marriage isn't the glue. It's just couples in Scandinavia stay together, even if they aren't married, in ways that couples in the United States don't. So even if you had, and I think there are things you can do on the margin to help people with childcare, you're still left with part of the divide between Scandinavia and here is that Scandinavian couples stay together more than American couples do. The larger point on the sexual revolution, I do think there is some evidence that upper-class Americans are more culturally conservative today. They're, if you ask, again, this isn't Brad's research, but if you ask well-educated Americans, should divorce be harder to get, for instance, legally, the percentage saying yes has gone up. On a number of questions, and even on something like church-going, there's now a divide where upper-middle-class Americans, even though they're not wildly religious, are more likely to be in church on Sunday than lower-class Americans. So there is a cultural component. Then on the broader sexual revolution question, I think it's useful in some ways to think of an analogy to the Industrial Revolution here, right? Yes, the sexual revolution was in many ways driven by technology in ways that we aren't going to change. We aren't going to go back to a world before the birth control pill was invented. But that doesn't, you don't want to be in a position of saying everything good that happened in the sexual revolution depends on everything bad that happened in it. Because then you're like the people in 1860s England who said, look at the great wealth the Industrial Revolution has produced, therefore we cannot have child labor laws that prevent us from sending 5-year-olds up to clean chimneys. That is, I think, the problem that cultural liberalism has ended up in the United States today, in the desire, the admirable desire to preserve the very real gains to women that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years across a range of issues. Cultural liberals are deeply resistant to the idea that any of the, frankly, negative social aspects of the sexual revolution can be addressed. It's just the world we have to live with, because anything else would be a return to, female disempowerment. I think that is a big mistake, and now Jamel can tell you why I'm wrong.
No, I actually have a way more pessimistic point than that.
That's what we need, more pessimism.
More pessimism. So in thinking about policy interventions and tax credits and everything we can do, I feel there is something that people are just reluctant to address, and that is, to a large degree, Americans' attitudes towards distribution writ large has a lot to do with their attitudes towards race. And so part of my pessimism and skepticism has a lot to do with the fact that it's still difficult in this country to propose any sort of targeted intervention that involves large sums of money without also running into sort of Americans' uneasiness with the idea of giving, to put it bluntly, giving money to brown people. And, my broader pessimism about America is that I'm not sure if it's possible to have this sort of small government egalitarianism or working class welfare state in a very racially diverse but not necessarily cohesive society.
And on that happy note,
That's totally possible.
please stay where you are. This panel is going to go down. The next panel is going to come up. Please join me in thanking the panel.